Okay, I think we'll get started. Can you, is this on? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Miriam Zargar-Deloff, and I'm Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Humanitarian Action Initiative at the Elliott School. I'm so pleased that you've joined us for this talk today, Anthroencryption, Strategies for Protecting Vulnerable Populations. You're joined by Timothy Quinn of the Dark Data Project and Professor Babak Bahadur. And I'm going to introduce both of them and then hand it over to Professor Bahadur. So Tim Quinn is a senior operations and technology leader with 25 years of hands-on experience focusing on technical product development, real-world data architecture, and sustainable governance. Tim is the founder of the Dark Data Project, a Toronto-based organization which helps companies, governments, and nonprofits with challenging data barriers, particularly uncollected, obfuscated, otherwise problematic data sets. His team works on a broad range of issues, including homelessness and joblessness, biodiversity, representation for Indigenous and rural populations, land and water rights, opportunities for small business and long-term economic and environmental sustainability. Prior to founding the Dark Data Project, Tim was a co-founder of HateBase, which provided lexicographic data to assist in violence prevention. Tim is also currently the Director of Global Supply Chain Impacts with Sustainalytics, where he works on tracking socioeconomic attributes of large government procurements. Professor Babak Bahadur is a research professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He holds a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. His research focuses on the overlap of media and politics and international relations with a primary focus on peace building. At GW, he directs the Media and Peace Building Project, which aims to bridge the gap between academic research and peace building practice. This event is co-sponsored by the Humanitarian Action Initiative, the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, and the Media and Peace Building Project, all here at the George Washington University. And I'd also like to extend my deep gratitude to Elise Meyer, Margot Kunith, and Rebecca Trumbull for their tireless efforts in organizing this event. Thank you very much. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. So in 2022, the UNHCR announced that over 100 million people were displaced around the world, which is 1.2% of the globe's population. 32.5 million of those were refugees. As these people are processed by NGOs, IGOs, and governments, their data is captured, stored, and shared. But how do we ensure that the data on human identity is protected and safely shared? That's the focus of today's talk by Timothy Quinn. I first met Timothy online. In fact, I'm meeting for the first time in person today through his work with HateBase, which was the leading source of hate speech data from around the world. I myself was working on hate speech research at the time, and I found him to be very generous in helping academics with their work by sharing a lot of this information. In 2020, Tim founded the Dark Data Project, which is a team of data scientists, technical project managers, and humanitarian policy experts, which offers advisory services, an incubator program for innovative startups, but also devotes 50% of its time to pro bono work, working with nonprofit initiatives to try to promote their agenda. So with that, I will pass it on to Tim to share with us his insights today on how to protect the world's most vulnerable people through Anthroencryption. Please, Tim. And then we'll have a time for Q&A after the talk.
That's great. Thank you very much. All right, we got a lot to get through. There we go. So before we get into Anthroencryption, I guess I want to start with the big picture, and I want to talk about dark data, which is really the ecosystem that this problem exists in. And dark data is obviously the reason why the Dark Data Project was created. It impacts all of us, regardless of where our identity data happens to be stored. And it affects every facet of our lives, from housing to healthcare to our justice system to how we model our economy. I do a lot of work with economic impact modeling, and clearly we see the influence of dark data there as well. And these are all processes where we think people are using evidence-based decision making, and that's not always the case. We often make decisions based on an absence of data or on a misperception of data, or we draw inferences from data. And that's a big part of what I want to talk about today. So there are several slightly different definitions for dark data. The one that we're going to use today is any data which should be accessible, available, but isn't, is what we're going to consider dark data. And so I want to give you a few examples that show the breadth of that definition. So right now, roughly half of all births in Africa go unrecorded. A smaller number of those get recorded as deaths, and an even smaller number of those, there's a cause of death. We have access to lots of public government data, although sometimes we have to beg and plead for it. But there's clearly lots of other data that we don't necessarily have access to that isn't shared with us, and often to our detriment. We share lots of healthcare data, although there's tons more healthcare data that we don't have access to, again, potentially to our detriment. There's always going to be data that we don't have access to because it's of strategic confidentiality or it's for profit. And as we all know, our justice system generates an incredible amount of data, and it is not yet unheard of for information to be withheld in the interest of prosecution. War casualties. We are pretty good at counting our own dead, but not so good at everybody else. Records management. We have digitized a lot of data, but there's still a huge amount of information that's solely available on paper, and there are organizations that are frantically trying to ingest that stuff and save it before it's lost forever. Monolingualism. Right now, I think about 25% of the internet is in English, as opposed to a decade ago where it was 75%. So that's certainly an improving trend, but it does mean that there's still a lot of information out there that is solely available in English and not available to non-English speakers. News, there is news that is true and accurate and fairly sourced, and then there is news that is not, and it might be wrong accidentally, in which case we call it information. It might be wrong deliberately, in which case we call it disinformation. Biodiversity is an area that we do a fair bit of work in with our data project. We know of just over 1 million species in the world and declining rapidly. And we suspect there are an additional 7.5 million species out there and declining rapidly. Shell corporations, tax havens, textbook definition of dark data, if for no other reason than these sorts of structures perpetuate inequalities and corruption. And then you have open source software and closed source software. So open source software, I think 80 and 90% of all organizations have open source software somewhere in their tech stack, usually layered beneath proprietary code. So an example would be, got an insurance app, there's maybe an open source mail server underneath. And so these two things work together, the open source and the closed source. So I like to think of dark data as really a whole taxonomy of issues. And I like the cosmological principle because it really does feel like dark matter. The idea that you can't necessarily see it, but you can feel it. You can feel it in all the stuff that you can see. And so I guess the point here is that I think there's lots of room for us to do better. I think we need professionals, we need students, we need volunteers. It's a big problem set. So there's opportunities for everyone to work on this stuff. The point I guess I'm trying to make isn't that there shouldn't be dark data. It would be nice if we could get rid of some of it. But there are clearly areas where dark data is necessary. And so it's obviously entirely appropriate that people's personal medical histories, they should have an expectation of privacy around that stuff. Competitive corporate data should obviously be be allowed to be confidential. I would say our government, our military should have some latitude to operate in a covert fashion. I think there's value, as I mentioned before, in both open and in closed source software. Corporations need to be able to keep trade secrets. Content creators, artists, writers, they need to be able to have some expectation of copyright, albeit with hopefully some fair use provisions. And I think there are obviously uses where privacy is paramount in the legal system, specifically when you're dealing with minors. So where does dark data come from? In a lot of cases, it starts out dark. And so a perfect example would be all this uncollected biodiversity data. And it brightens as it becomes more and more an area of priority for different organizations to bring that data into the light. But it is just as likely that data becomes dark by being obfuscated or hidden in some fashion. And that isn't necessarily a good or bad thing, but it can have good or bad impacts. Obviously, I think it's valuable that we should be able to communicate with each other securely. We should have some expectation of personal privacy. We should be able to have some confidentiality around our legal and our financial affairs, and we should have some expectation of physical safety, which it shouldn't be evident to everybody in the world where we are at any given point in time. The flip side of that, though, is that we don't want to empower illicit activities. We prefer to avoid malware, ransomware. Corruption obviously thrives in the dark data world where there isn't transparency, and you get problems like data siloing where there are sharing restrictions between data sets. So I think the most important point that I'd like to make here is that these are really issues that involve you and I, us as individuals, not just corporations, not just governments. These are things that really pertain to us individually. So I've kind of taken the long way around to get to talking about Anthroencryption, but now I want to talk about this one specific type of encryption. And I want to talk about why it's extremely important, and I think it's often underappreciated and underrecognized. So what is it? Anthroencryption is protecting in a shareable fashion information about us, about people. So name, age, gender and sexual orientation, ethnicity and nationality, various forms of ID and biometrics, our family information on our families, on our politics, our finances, our medical situation, even information about where we are and where we've been. So this is extremely sensitive data. It's extremely sensitive also when we are the caretakers for this data on behalf of other people. And when you personally have an expectation of privacy around this stuff, and some people do and some people don't, and it's a floating scale. I think it's not unreasonable to say that most people would prefer that there be some level of privacy. And this is, in fact, why countries have privacy legislation. The sorts of people who tend to get burned the most when Anthroencryption goes awry are refugees, asylum seekers, whistleblowers, the homeless, victims of genocide. I'm going to take any guesses on, does anybody know who the second photo is? I'm just curious. I could have put up Snowden, but that would have been too easy. Anybody? Okay, so there's Mark Felt, who was, and I was reminded because I was walking by the Watergate the other day, it was Mark Felt who was revealed to be the primary source for Woodward and Bernstein on the Watergate affair. In any event, it's these sorts of people who tend to get burned when this stuff isn't done right. And not just when data is inadvertently disclosed, but also sometimes when disclosure doesn't happen. So you can imagine if there's a refugee flow coming out of a terrible situation, people crossing borders, going into an aid camp, and recounting what they've experienced to whichever aid organization is providing assistance. And then because there isn't adequate sharing of that data between different aid organizations or different entities, then they have to recount that over and over and over again. And I hear this all the time from NGOs that work on these sorts of issues, that re-traumatizing is a big problem because that data isn't as easily shared, and it isn't easily shared because it's very, very sensitive. How do you share that kind of stuff without putting people in jeopardy? And that's really what we're talking about today. And I think it kind of begs the question, why is identity data a particular problem for vulnerable populations. And it's because there's a lack of awareness and there's a lack of agency. If you don't know that your data is being stored, and especially if you're not old enough to understand the implications to consent to that storage, then you're not going to have awareness or agency. And even if you do know that that data is being stored, as with whistleblowers or confidential informants to the police or to the media, you don't know how it's being stored. You don't know how safely it's being stored. Trust me, it's not being stored safely at all. And there are also situations where you do have agency, but you might not have awareness. So an example would be if your data is, and again, your data is with a credit bureau, you do have credit ratings out there. But if you don't have awareness of it, then you don't necessarily, then whether you have agency to change that or not is really kind of moot. Which also begs the question of why isn't this just a security problem? If we just do a better job of following security standards like GDPR and COPPA, doesn't that kind of solve the problem? Why can't we just be really, really good at application level security and network level security and operational security? And the answer is not really, or at least not entirely. Identity data is fundamentally different than other types of data that we protect. And it's different because we often collect it when we don't need to, and because we protect it quite often in a way that's not easily shareable. So we really need to stop thinking of identity data as emails or files on your company file server or banking records or financial data. It's entirely different. There's a level of additional nuance when we talk about identity data. So what are these nuances? Well, for one thing, it's a hell of a lot more sensitive and the implications are a lot higher. It's often immutable. Identity data, if you're capturing information on dates of birth, on ethnicity, mother's maiden name, which I'll talk more about in a moment with security challenges, you can't change that stuff. So once that goes into a database, it's there and you live with that for the rest of your life. I would also argue it's often collected unnecessarily considering the purposes that we ultimately use it for. Very difficult to share safely. And most importantly, it's unevenly impactful when it's breached. And that's really the point that I'm trying to make here, that it's vulnerable people specifically who are going to be impacted because they may not have had the opportunity to give appropriate consent to the collection of this data. So for us to take, I guess what I call a more nuanced view of encrypting identity, we need to follow what I call the principle of least implementation. If anybody has a security background, then they know that's a variation of the principle of least access. It's the need to know principle. And so there are countless examples of data which is collected and is totally inappropriate from a risk-reward perspective. A good example is a classic security challenge or password hint, and we've all done this. And I'm telling you, your bank does not need to know your mother's maiden name. It doesn't need to know the city in which you were born or the school that you attended or the mascot of your high school football team. Giving this immutable data to organizations where it can be breached puts you in jeopardy, because if it gets breached in one place, then it essentially gets breached everywhere else that has that data. So if we're going to have an Anthroencryption framework, what exactly does it look like? And what it looks like is actually, it's a stack. It's layered in order of complexity and risk. And as you go down the levels, generally complexity increases and risk increases. And so this is what we call the tiered model of Anthroencryption. So I want to go through these one by one, and there are 5 of them. The first one is unidentification, which has a very Orwellian name, but it's a really good way of thinking about the problem. It is, needless to say, the least invasive, and so it tends to be the most preferred approach. So lots of transactional organizations, and by transactional organizations, I'm talking about food banks, homeless shelters, mobile vaccination clinics. They really only need incremental or statistical data. And so incremental data is data on how many people are using a service over a unit of time. Transactional data is which services are being used most, perhaps by which socioeconomic groups. And yet, even though they only need this level of data, they're still collecting personally identifiable data. And generally, it's for a few understandable reasons. Maybe they want to avoid duplication of services. It's not unusual for them to have requirements from their funders that you have to be able to provide us very detailed information on the people who are using your service. And when I talk about duplication of services, it's actually a euphemism for a lot of not very nice things. So hoarding, profiteering, corruption, so stuff that you would probably want to avoid if you could. So why are we collecting this data? Well, in some countries, simple counting methodologies like inked fingertips have been enormously effective at preventing election fraud with relatively little abuse. So you compare that with the risks of over-policing vulnerable populations. And you don't have to go to Afghanistan to imagine the negative impacts. You can imagine landlords being disinclined to rent to somebody who has periods of homelessness or joblessness. You can imagine insurers being hesitant to offer coverage or jacking up premiums because of previous medical conditions or even tests for previous medical conditions. So how do you tackle that? Well, if you want to do simply counting, which is what a lot of these transactional organizations end up doing, there's really a couple different ways that you can do it. You've got passive counting and active counting. Passive counting, again, tends to be the preferred from our perspective because it's the least invasive. So you're basically counting stuff after people are out of the room. And so you can count consumed services, you can count unconsumed services. Consumed services would be syringes, disposable gloves, vaccine vials. Unconsumed services, sandwiches, drink boxes. When I got vaccinated, I got a little "I was vaccinated" sticker, so you can count stickers that aren't getting out. When you vote, you get "I voted" sticker, same deal. Pros and cons. So obviously, you've got easy access to that data. You can take your time counting it. And I would argue that there's more dignity to recipients. It's being done behind the curtain. The downside is that it's arguably going to be less precise. So it's a question of whether that's a downside that you're going to accommodate. Active counting is a little bit different, and you do it with the participation of recipients. You're either counting people or you're counting redeemable tokens. And so counting people, generally, it's a turnstile or somebody with a little clicker at the door as people are going by. Redeemable tokens, it's really just giving out tickets. And so if you've ever gone somewhere and been given a ticket and then told to queue up somewhere else, and you've wondered, why the hell is that a two-step process? That's why. It's because they're counting the tickets. They're doing active counting. Again, there are pros and cons. The pros are you're doing the monitoring in real time. You don't have to wait till the whole thing is over, so you can get a count at any point. Generally pretty accurate. The downside, as you can imagine, it feels a whole hell of a lot like policing, and that in and of itself is not good, but it can also discourage use. And this has been a problem, obviously, with homeless shelters, that you're trying to encourage people to come in out of the cold and use services, and if they feel like they're being ordered to do certain things, then they don't want to be in that environment at all. And so you end up not being able to give out that service that you're trying to provision. Okay, so let's talk about another form of Anthroencryption. It's something that you've seen plenty of times before, whether it's election results, census outputs, even a poll at work that measures employee satisfaction. These are all forms of aggregation. So why would we choose to capture and then aggregate data? Well, sometimes it's important to get the initial identity data, but then you don't really need it to present your results. You really just need the summary data. And so we talked a little bit about elections in countries where there might not be the infrastructure for rigorous identity verification. Frankly, it's just more important that people vote. Petitions and censuses, Petitions and censuses are essentially volumetric measurements. You're also going to want to quantify recipients of aid, victims of crime, policing activities, troop levels, shareholder distribution, audience analytics. These are all examples where the value really is in the aggregate as opposed to the individual identities, which are obviously sensitive. And when you're doing aggregation, you really have a couple choices. You can do attributable or destructive aggregation. Attributable aggregation allows auditability. You're saving the initial data set in case it's ever questioned. So an obvious example, would be election results here in the US are an example of aggregated data, which has both short-term and long-term auditability. Short-term because you want to preserve the chain of custody. Long-term, if an election result is ever questioned by a significant percentage of the population or by an outgoing president, which could, of course, never happen. Destructive aggregation means that data is destroyed immediately, generally following aggregation. And it's really, again, it's preferred approach because it prevents future unintended misuse. And that's why it's also one of the core elements of GDPR. So I really don't want us to underestimate the risk of future misuse. Long-term storage is inherently risky. It's data that you just keep lying around for years and years and years. It gets forgotten. It gets missed in security audits. It gets missed in transfers of responsibility. It may even be saved on like legacy media. It might be saved on like magnetic tapes and CDRs and stuff like that. So just in general, destructive is the better approach. Of course, the risk of aggregation is de-anonymization. And that happens when you've got a data set that's small enough that you can winnow it down. And so I've got an example here from Google Analytics, which obviously looks at website traffic. And you have an aggregated data set, which doesn't tell you too much about the individuals. But you see that you can winnow it down by country, by state, down to the community level. And if you happen to know that one guy in Beaver Falls, which, by the way, is a population of 9,000 souls, then you've just de-anonymized that person's identity. I've been talking a lot about Anthroencryption, but I'm going to throw another term out there, which is Ethnoencryption. And that's really the practice of obfuscating ethnicity to protect populations from discrimination and violence. And the goal is to reduce the risk that individuals can be identified through targeting a specific population. And this is one of the things that happened in the 1994 Rwandan genocide when government forces were able to identify Tutsis from their ID cards. It's also not dissimilar to what happened in Nazi Germany when Jewish Germans also had their ethnicity stamped on ID cards. Obviously, in 21st century North America, we don't carry around ID cards with, I was going to say with our gender and sexual orientation, then I checked my passport back at the hotel and my gender is on there. So we don't carry around ID cards that have our sexual orientation in any event, but we do, regardless, routinely provide this and other demographic data. And this sort of data can be used beyond mere demographics. And so a good example that I'm sure many people have heard about is studies that show that resumes that imply a specific gender or ethnicity are fundamentally treated differently. So the final thought I'd like to add is just, it's also important to remember that outside of this room, this very progressive group of people, a third of the world's countries criminalize being anything other than heterosexual. And so having this data easily accessible in any fashion is a potential risk. When you aggregate data, one of the things you want to be really, really careful about, or I'm sure this is something you've heard about, is the correlation interface. You may have heard it called the mosaic effect. And so if you imagine you've got a bunch of open data, you've got a bunch of confidential data, which is still hackable and gets hacked all the time, and then you've got your obfuscated data set in the middle. This is the gem. This is what you're trying to unlock. And how you do it is that you know that you have all these immutable qualities that are shared between these different data sets. And this is just representative. There's other stuff in here. There's IP addresses, there's IMEI numbers, there are postal code lookups. All these things can be used to correlate data and ultimately potentially reveal an individual from an aggregate. And this really does come again from this problem of capturing immutable data on individuals. All right, how are we doing? Okay, I want to talk about irreversible encryption. So this is the next form of Anthroencryption. And what this basically means is we're retaining the source data, but we're encrypting it in such a way that it can never, again, be decrypted. And I want to explain some use cases where this is a really useful tool. Whether you know it or not, you encounter irreversible encryption every day. You log into a website. You put in your password. That password is hashed. It's stored in a database. You come back to the website later. You put in your password. That's hashed, compared with the one in the database. And if they match, you are who you say that you are. And I want to say that all websites now do this, but the reality is that even though this is kind of like security 101, and it's been around for decades, some don't. So if you ever find a website that instead of sending you a link to reset your password, but actually sends you your damn password, walk away very quickly, because they're storing it in clear text. So what they should be doing is hashing. Now, the beauty of irreversible encryption is that the clear text obviously is never saved in the database. And I say in general because in truth, bad hashes of bad passwords can, in theory, be reverse engineered using brute force, but it's a comparatively low risk, and it's certainly not as high a risk as saving in clear text. The idea with irreversible encryption is that you're creating a digital fingerprint. You're trying to capture the uniqueness of an individual without retaining personally identifiable information. And so this is an example that I want to share with you from an organization that we work with called the Rural Development Network in Western Canada. What they do is they try to quantify numbers of homelessness in rural and remote areas. And it's very, very difficult to count the homeless in an urban area. It is so much more difficult in a rural area. And then you've got to save that data. You don't want to count people twice. And the reason that you want to count people in the first place is because if you don't know how big the problem is, then you can't go to funders and say, give me money to build housing. So it's really, really important that you have an accurate count. What the RDN does, which is really neat, is that they take the first two letters of the first name, they take the first two letters of the last name, they sum up the numbers in the birth date, they append the two numbers of the year of birth, and then they put on a final character for the gender. And what they wind up with is a hash, essentially. It's a very simple hash, and this is something they do manually. They do it on a clipboard, walking around in a room. So if they're doing that manually, you can imagine that you can create even more, with automation, even more cryptographically secure hashes. And you can do something called salting, which makes sure that the hashes that you create are not going to be the same as the hashes that other organizations create in other domains. Again, this is security 101, and yet there's still companies a few years ago, and I've got to stop picking on them in talks, but a few years ago, LinkedIn got breached, and I remember the CTO put out a message afterwards and said, oh, well, you know what, I think from now on we're going to start salting our passwords. I was like, really? I would have thought you would have done that when you started the company decades ago. In any event, the purpose here is that we're trying to create a digital fingerprint. It can be as custom as you want, as secure as you want. And if you end up building a hash that goes all the way to the side of the room, it doesn't really matter how big or how complex that hash is. You can throw a check digit on the end, which is how UPC codes work. It's how ISBNs work. So the world is hashable is I guess the point that I'm trying to make. That data is hashable, but so are documents. So are clusters of documents. Biometric data is hashable. You can take a scan of an iris and you can hash the critical points there and save that without having to save the original source data. And that de-risks all kinds of use cases when you don't necessarily want to keep all this biometric data, all this immutable data sitting around in a database where it's vulnerable. Okay, now we're getting to heavy lifting. So reversible encryption is the type of encryption that everybody means when they talk about encryption. When people use the word encryption, they think of reversible encryption. It's literally locking something with a key, and then in the future using that exact same key to unlock it again with all the benefits and all the risks that entails. So your online banking, your school transcripts, your HMO data, that is how all of that stuff is locked away. And when you reversibly encrypt something or two-way encrypt something, it's all about the key. Many of us rely on passwords, which frankly don't have a great track record in humanitarian contexts. Fingerprints are also common, although they can be problematic if you're dealing with manual laborers. They don't necessarily have as good fingerprints or as reliable fingerprint matches. Iris scanners are a bit more reliable than fingerprints. You get into RSA tokens, these hardware tokens here. You find them mainly in financial or high security environments. They're not particularly practical. You can't really expect, as you have refugee flows coming through a country, to give everybody an RSA token and say, listen, come back tomorrow and bring your RSA token. You've got voice prints. There are some issues with voice prints around accuracy. And as far as I know, they're really only being used for secondary validation. 3 of these examples are biometric technologies, which, as we've talked about, are problematic because what ends up happening is that you end up throwing all of this immutable biometric data into a database where it becomes vulnerable to breaches. And if it does get breached, as I've said before, it gets breached forever. You just can't change your iris. You're stuck with it. So what are the risks of this locked vault approach to Anthroencryption? Well, data can be stored with weak algorithms. It can be stored with what we consider strong algorithms today, but in the future, they're going to be weak algorithms. RSA tokens, as we've talked about, they can be lost, they can be stolen, passwords can be hacked, biometrics have all kinds of reliability problems, and immutable and endemic attributes are really locked for life. Now, the good news is, though, after all this bad news, the good news is that most breaches are not super hacker, sexy breaches like heist movies. Most breaches are just sloppy security. So the good news is that even if you are stuck with storing very sensitive data, the breaches can be prevented by putting in place a reasonable level of security. So it's important to remember the purpose of Anthroencryption isn't just to keep data, it is to share data. And when you lock everything away, you make it harder to share that data. So in other words, what you might gain in storage, you lose through inhibiting shareability. So how do you share locked data? You share keys. And when you start sharing keys, you're now in the key management business. And so the reality is, if you want to share data, if you want to share keys, you're going to have to provide multiple services with redundant intake. You're going to want to try and avoid re-traumatizing victims, which is why you're sharing keys in the first place. And you want to safely share witness testimony. I don't know, a good example would be if you're trying to prosecute a war crime. You want to be able to safely share witness testimony between a number of organizations across transnational justice systems. And to do that, you really need to be sharing keys. So that's the big disadvantage of this approach. There's one last approach. I'm rounding it up here. There's one last approach to Anthroencryption that I want to talk about. And it's an area of active research for us. It has the potential to de-risk a lot of use cases specifically around oppressive surveillance scenarios, and it's called deniable encryption. One of the biggest weaknesses of encrypted data is that it just looks encrypted. And so if you are a hacker or if you are a state entity, you're performing surveillance on human rights workers, anything that looks encrypted like that is going to set off alarm bells. And so ideally, there should be a way to take clear text and transform it into encrypted data that looks like real data. So you still got email, password, date of birth. They look very plausible. It's just not the correct data. It's been deniably encrypted. And so if you think you haven't heard of deniable encryption, you have. It's actually been used for a long time. It's the means by which criminals have traditionally tried to subvert surveillance. Usually wiretaps. It's a bit of a cliche of mob movies that criminals use euphemisms when discussing illegal transactions. And so this here is a snippet. I don't know if you can see the highlight yet. It's a snippet of a famous wiretap used in the Pizza Connection case in the mid-'80s. So you had heroin being imported from Sicily, cocaine from South America, and all of it was being distributed through pizzerias throughout the United States. And so you can see in the wiretap, of course, we're not talking about heroin, cocaine. We're talking about shirts, the quality of the shirts, the price of the shirts, the volume of the shirts. And we still do it today, but we call it something different. We call it a dog whistle. So international banks, global special interests, purebloods, these are all anti-Semitic dog whistles. Inner city crime, CRT, dog whistles for people of color. And all of these are essentially being used as deniable encryption. They're saying one thing while meaning another. If you do want to create a custom deniable cipher, you're going to need one of two things. You're going to need some sort of algorithm that can encode and decode a pretty wide range of data. And I've got an example here of a very simple transposition cipher. Hopefully we use something more complex than this, but you can see it still outputs a plausible email address. The other approach you can take is forget about the algorithm and simply create a lookup database. So you've got one database with your real data, one database with your fake data, and you've got some sort of relationship between the two. You can imagine the disadvantage of that. It's like, well, if you're a hacker, you're going to go for this guy. I'm going to hack this guy. All right, so I just want to go through 5 takeaways, and then I'd like to open it up to questions. And number 1, identity data, as I've mentioned a few times, really can't be treated as just part of an organization's overall online security process. It is fundamentally more nuanced and more sensitive, and it puts much more risk on vulnerable populations when their data is encrypted and breached. Number 2, different levels of identity security are appropriate for different use cases, and what differentiates levels of Anthroencryption is the type of data stored and the degree to which it can be safely shared. Number 3, always think about the principle of least implementation. Capture the least amount of data necessary for a given use case, and that's going to reduce your vulnerability. In essence, just don't bank data for some future unknown use that you might have sometime down the road. Number 4, be mindful of correlation inference and be very aware of what available data sets are out there and can be used to de-anonymize. As I think I mentioned before, a government, for instance, in a state surveillance scenario, they don't need to hack the driver's license registry. They have access to the driver's license registry. So these things are not only hackable, they're available, and they can be used with endemic qualities to identify obfuscated data. And then finally, as I do, worry about the future and let that inform your choice about what data to store. Think about how easy it would be today to hack data that was encrypted 50 years ago using antiquated algorithms. So I just want to conclude by saying, by providing all of these recommendations, doesn't apply in every conceivable situation, every use case you can imagine. Am I preaching gospel up here? And no, I'm simply giving you best practices and design principles. And in actual fact, these should be adapted for individual use cases as you see fit. There almost certainly will be scenarios where the benefits of a specific type of overcollection outweighs the risks of breach, and you have to make that decision on a case-by-case basis. I would say if there was one guiding principle that I would recommend, it's to be guided by a sense of responsibility and an aversion to risk when it comes to data about people, and let that inform your choices on a case-by-case basis. And that's it. Thank you very much. I know that was a lot of information to soak up, but I'm happy to answer any questions about any of that.